Thank you all. So it's a beautiful sunny day, and we're going to have a grim 2 hours right now. So
an hour and a half this week.
You haven't seen how big this is, so I told you this is about endurance. Okay, so I want to open with this quote. I just put it up here. It really essentially just sets the mood, and then I'm just gonna get started. Okay. And sometimes crossing on the moonbright line glimmers the skiff, faintly discerned a while, then lost in shadow. So that's from Charlotte Smith, who's going to come up a little later in my piece. So by 1811, Coleridge's addiction to laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, had reduced him to a state of desperation. Constantly fighting with John and Mary Morgan, who had given him a place to stay while he fought his addiction, he would flee to a temporary residence near Fleet Street, only to spiral deeper and end up fleeing back to the Morgans. To make things worse, in February, his close friend George Burnett, also an opium addict, had died an excruciatingly slow death in an infirmary, alone and destitute, the shock of which had propelled his close friend Mary Lamb into insanity and precipitated her internment at an asylum. Moreover, his intimate friendship with Wordsworth had collapsed only a few months before. Suffering from hallucinations, nightmares, screaming fits, and insomnia, he had virtually stopped publishing. His writing was reduced to private reflections, poetic fragments, and marginalia collected in his notebooks. In April of 1811, he wrote the following. Whoa, I gotta change that. There we go. The sick and sleepless man after the dawn of the fresh day, watching the smoke now from this and then from the other chimney of the town, from his bedchamber, as if willing to borrow from others the sense of a new day, of a discontinuity between the yesterday and the today, which his own sensations had not afforded. Barrier between, or dash, barrier between day and day. Observing himself in the impersonal, Coleridge notes the failure of the sick and sleepless man to distinguish between one day and another. His senses have failed him, and although he knows there is a difference, it has become purely nominal. The night has lost its differential function. His desire to borrow the barrier between days from others, that is, to borrow a sense of reality, represented by the dash, is telling. With the day under erasure, the barrier of the night is reduced to an artificial division between two blanks, two emptinesses. Watching himself, watching the plumes of smoke, he recalls the polarity of the given as though it were someone else's dream. What he watches is the barren field of anonymous existence rising up between two nothings, as presence turned against itself, watching him from the place of sleep's withdrawal. Coleridge's experience of enduring wakefulness without objects that depersonalize his subject is an experience of what I will call in this essay the nocturnal imagination. My focus will be primarily on the British Romantic tradition, mostly due to the fact that it is an area that I study. But the British Romantics present a unique case because they are mired in criticism that tends to present their version of the imagination, both in poetry and theory, as a productive faculty that nostalgically strives towards wholeness or idealism. What I aim to do today is to track an undercurrent within Romantic poetry that not only makes unity or closure impossible, but speaks to an entirely different set of concerns. Indeed, if as Paul de Man, Jeffrey Hartman, Tolado Marjan, and others have argued convincingly for an underlying existential anxiety or trauma that is constitutive of the Romantic imagination, my claim in this essay is that there is also a horror of existence as such. The nocturnal imagination is a vigilance. The nocturnal imagination is a vigilance of this horror that does not produce a coherent poetic image. Its broken figurations enable the poet to figure the night by short-circuiting the night. The essay is essentially made up of two parts. First, I will examine Edward Young's poem Night Thoughts with a view to establishing the problematic of the night rhetoric and temporality. Then I will turn to the romantics proper, for he's pre-romantic, technically, or whatever. Then I will turn to the romantics proper to do an overview of a series of poems that I take to constitute a nocturnal imagination as an effect of their work. So, to begin, I just want to justify this coinage, this idea of the nocturnal imagination. Throughout this conference, we have touched upon Heidegger's, Kant's, Baudelaire's theoretical concepts of the imagination. But because the theory of the British Romantic imagination is embedded in the poetry and is therefore shaped in its enactment, it carries with it numerous undercurrents that have yet to be articulated. And indeed, scholars often attempt to reckon with the fact that Romanticism is always in the plural, that it's very difficult to unite all of these Romantic poets together, especially under the concept of the imagination, and every attempt to do so ends up falling short. And to be sure, Shelley, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Keats all wrote theories of the imagination, much of which is very insightful, but their own theories do not fully account for the forms that they give rise to. In his classic work of criticism, The Mirror and the Lamp, M.H. Abrams makes the surprising claim that the Romantic imagination is in fact a theory of metaphor. In The Philosophy of Rhetoric, a fantastic book on metaphor, I.A. Richards makes a similar claim, citing Coleridge's theory of the symbol in particular. Richards' theory is also notable for linking metaphor with Freudian condensation and overdetermination already in 1936. The flaw with these early theories of metaphor were later made clear by the work of Paul de Man, Anne Malor, and others, in which rhetorical figures do not enable the poet to express the truth of their subjectivity, but rather trope or turn on this very subjectivity, always deviating it away from what they intend to say. What I have found is that the trope of the night does not only allow the poets to express a sublime interior vision, stage a scene of desire, or tropologically articulate an anxiety towards death. As de Man has convincingly shown in his programmatic analysis of Shelley's Triumph of Life in the Rhetoric of Romanticism, one does not need the night to figure the extreme or impossible case in which language does not merely mean or posit a position, but posits meaning as such. He says, this impossible position is precisely the figure, the trope, metaphor as a violent and not as a dark, but a light, a deadly Apollo. Rather, the specificity of the night, where the specificity of the night comes to figure in a certain strain and with a certain amount of strain is the appearance within language of that which is outside language. For the poetic subjects who undergo the ordeal, it is an experience not of anxiety, but of a horror of being, the horror of existing. The imagination is, in a sense, neutralized in these poems. Their rhetoric breaks down, leaving their subjects exposed, in Coleridge's coinage, to a death in life, with dashes, and reduced to a state of wakeful vigilance over the night. Coleridge himself spent a good part of his later life terrified at the thought that he had lost the imagination which he thought to be entwined with the creative principle of life. Yet he continued to write during these years, and not just essays or the monumental Biographia Literaria, but poetry too. It just became darker, stranger, and darker still because it was mainly written in notebooks that were never meant for the public. And in fact, he said, there are these notebook entries in which he says, these correspondences must be burned before I die, etc., etc. The theoretical problem at stake, which will be justified as I pass through the selection of poems, is the relation between the exteriority of writing and poetry. This is generally acknowledged to be a central problem for modernist poetry, yet it attains its first expression in the Romantic period, and not just in the fragments of the Jena Romantics. A principal reference point that needs to be stated up front is Levinas's notion of the ilia, or the there is, from existence and existence. This anonymous field of forces is the indeterminacy of being in general, that insists even when everything has disappeared. It is not the nothingness of the world one experiences in anxiety, as the radical contingency of one's own possible impossibility, As Levinas writes, this impersonal, anonymous, yet indistinguishable consummation of being, which murmurs in the depths of nothingness itself, we shall designate by the term there is. When the forms of things are dissolved in the night, the darkness of the night, which is neither an object nor the quality of an object, invades like a presence. This invasion of presence is what appears in nothingness when everything disappears. It is experience as the horror of the impossibility not to exist. Although experience should be taken provisionally in this case, as a concept. A suffocating existence with no exists is the formula. Ungraspable, it cannot be seized. One's imagination can be seized by it and riven to existence. And in various ways, this seizure will be figured in the Romantic poetry. So, in order to track the emergence of the nocturnal imagination, I'm going to start by going back in time before the Romantic period. So we're going to go back to the 18th century in order to articulate this relationship between the night and time in the rhetoric of Romanticism. To do this, we begin in the middle of the 18th century at the height of Enlightenment rationalism, where paradoxically, or maybe not paradoxically, the night becomes an object of intense poetic reflection. Edward Young is a poet who has been unfortunately tossed into the dustbin of literary history, a fact which is all the more ironic since he is also one of the great poets of wasted time in English literature. George Eliot, for example, wrote, one of the striking characteristics of Edward Young is his radical insincerity as a poetic artist. And, she continues, we think it of some importance to show that the night thoughts are a reflex of the mind in which the human sympathies were inactive. Indeed, the night thoughts represents a poetic decadence that privileges rhetoric over subjective expression and the fleeting ephemerality of existence over human sympathies. In his day, he was compared with Shakespeare and Milton. Now he has become obscure. And his legacy was preserved, funnily enough, as these English poets often are, like Poe, for example, preserved by foreigners, preserved by the Germans. Goethe, for example, said that he learned how to read English by reading Edward Young. Night Thoughts is composed of 9 long poems, each of which occurs over the course of one night. It is essentially a didactic religious poem in the voice of a poet-preacher. That, in the voice of a poet-preacher, instructs its readers on how to actualize the possibilities of their lives for God. Pretty basic concept. This is the root of his radical sincerity. As a reader of the poem will quickly realize from the first 2 books, God is something of an afterthought. The preacher does not demand that the reader be faithful to God, but to be faithful to the nature of time. And time as a problem for oneself. The central problem for Young is that most people don't understand their relation to time. For Young, the night and time are inextricably linked in a rhetoric that fluctuates quickly between irony and allegory. This is a key point that separates him from other so-called graveyard school poets. Situated in a neoclassical context, they use the traditional memento mori poem to force a meditation on death. Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard and Blair's The Grave are paradigmatic examples of this trend, in which the dark obscurity of the night sets the stage for grisly visions of moldering tombs, grinning skulls, haunting presences, and inexplicable sounds that aim to lure the reader into a meditation on death as the great leveler and the scarcity of time. The erotics of the night are unmistakable in these poems as they seduce their sentimental readers into a life of virtue and spiritual union with God. Young is often lumped in with them for the obvious reason that he too seduces his readers with the night's eroticism. Yet he is distinct from them in the overall context of 18th century British poetry, because for him, time and death are not abstractions that one meditates on in the night. Rather, they are constitutive of being a person, a subject, a human at all, precisely because of the night's essential anonymity. For Young, the night is an inner experience in which one risks slipping into death unknowingly and inauthentically in an exposure to the pure exteriority of time. The dread that time inspires causes us to repress it. The preacher's demand is that we expose ourselves to it. It sounds like an anachronism to describe an 18th century poet in these terms. I myself was caught off guard when I first read Young. But like the poet says about his own daytime fantasies, starting I woke and found myself undone. This reversal of waking and sleeping is an important first point. Night the first opens with an apostrophe to sleep. That should be on there. Tired nature's sweet restorer, balmy sleep. He, like the world, his ready visit pays where fortune smiles. The wretched he forsakes, swift on his downy pinion, flies from woe, and lights on lids unsullied with a tear. From short as usual and undisturbed repose I wake. How happy they who wake no more. Yet that were vain, if dreams infest the grave. The speaker does not belong to the world of dreams. Dreams ensure that one can sleep, and sleep is for those who are safe from torment. The speaker is not. Instead, the speaker becomes the nightmare that he wakes from, becomes a failed dream that forces him into wakefulness. But being awake is not an escape from the nightmare. It is the nightmare as an experience of being awake. Waking up is not a metaphor for spiritual illumination. In waking up, the poet awakens to the horror of existence. But why should existence be horrifying? After all, isn't death the thing that everyone fears, with dread or anxiety as the mood of its disclosure, as one's own most possibility? And certainly, as we will see, this Heideggerian theme is present in Jung's poem too. But what is striking here is that death would be a sweet relief, so long as in death one was actually dead. As the poem proceeds, the poet explains what he watches over in his nighttime vigil. The bell strikes... There we go. The bell strikes one. We take no note of time, but from its loss. To give it then a tongue is wise in man. In Jung's view, knowledge of time becomes possible on the condition that it has been lost. This necessary untimeliness situates human knowledge in a relation of belatedness to experience. Time is not merely fleeting, it is loss as such, or loss is the existence of time. A pure ephemerality annihilates the present in every instant. Not even speech can grasp this movement, though it does remark it, to draw on a useful Derridian structure. The human animal's innovation is to make this loss speak in a discourse that is always too late. If heard aright, it is the canal of my departed hours. Where are they? With the years beyond the flood. It is the signal that demands dispatch. How much is to be done? My hopes and fears start up alarmed, and over life's narrow verge, look down on what? A fathomless abyss. A dread eternity, how surely mine. And can eternity belong to me, poor pensioner, on the bounties of an hour? Yeah. I don't know if that's boredom or like the night. That's crickets. Like, oh God, nobody likes the Edward Young. Okay, you're not convinced. You're not convinced. I get it. So, we are therefore provided with one of Jung's paradoxical formulations. Time is at once surely mine and absolutely exterior to me. This is due to the fact that time is not merely exterior to me, but as pure loss is exterior to itself. The instant, or what Jung will call the moment, is always split between the loss of the present instant and the eternal night. By articulating an instant in language, as one would by saying now, the now is pronounced at once, is at once an articulated instant and becomes an allegorical sign for every now, past and future. As a subject of language, we are the being whose existence is this narrow verge. The being whose existence is loss, only to be remarked in passing. A remarking that always comes first insofar as the present instance is constituted in advance by its deferral in the symbolic. Time is mine insofar as I only have the present, but this present is neither present to itself nor to me. Watching over the constitutive excess of time brings about an experience of what Jung calls the general horror of existence, because even if I die, time will not die with me. I will be lost to time, but time itself will continue to exist. My death cannot remove me from existence. My death is rather the very appearance of existence that in life I tried to defer. Thus the preacher instructs Lorenzo. Lorenzo is this figure of the reader in the poem who he's speaking to. He instructs Lorenzo that procrastination is the thief of time, and that he should be wise today. 'Tis madness to defer. This is where the symbolic deferral of remarking time in language is characterized as an existential condition. Since all sensual man, because untouched, unseen, he looks on time as nothing. Nothing else is truly man's, 'tis fortune's. Time is a god. In these three lines, we get Jung's critique of the everyday and rationalist conceptions of time. The problem is that on the screen. Yeah. The problem is that because time does not appear and cannot be felt, time appears as nothing. The mistake of rationalism, on the other hand, the mistake of rationalism is to take the sign of time or the measure of time as time itself. In its everydayness, time is converted into fortune or fate, or time as a god. In both cases constitute a flight from time considered as a burden. The rationalist has too much time and is compelled to shrink it into a measure. The all-sensual man has too little time and flees from its pursuit. In addition, Jung establishes that there is an allegorical figure of capital T time, which he uses throughout the text. This time is also Mark's time, as well as using the now. He'll use the moment. He'll use the word time, always capitalized. But the capital T time used throughout the text is precisely the signifier which is too often mistaken for time itself. More specifically, time functions as a prosopopoeia in the text. According to its etymological roots of prosopon as face and poein as giving or making, prosopopoeia is a mode of allegory in which what can have no face and cannot be made present can be given a face and figured as present in its absence. Time is therefore the face of loss, but to face loss by facing the signifier time is already to misrecognize it as a sensual object of intuition divorced from experience. Thus, to face time is to efface time, to forget that time is always one's own time. This situation can be summed up as follows. I'm not sure if this makes it clearer, but the defacement of time is faced by the face of time that effaces it. Forcing the reader to take up a position relative to the text, a position on the verge of existence, the disfiguration of time becomes an allegory of reading. Not the signifier as a legible word, but the void in the signifier that the image disavows. That this reading implicitly draws on Paul de Man should be clear. At the same time, it clarifies why he thinks that allegory articulates an ontological difference, why Paul de Man thinks that allegory articulates an ontological difference. By imposing time upon the reader, it marks a separation between the restricted temporality of the figure and the unaccountable temporality of subjective experience, that the figural both inscribes and forgets. Thus, the experience of time is constituted by a symbolic deferral, and deferral is the means by which one flees from the burden that is figured by the face of time. The latter is the everyday experience of time, in which one attempts to flee from the burden of existence. Jung writes, "We waste, not use our time." And waste and use should be italicized, but we waste, not use our time. We breathe, not live. Time is wasted existence. Time wasted is existence. Used is life. And bare existence, man, to live ordained, wrings and oppresses with enormous weight. By fleeing from the experience of time as bare existence, one actually ends up increasing its burdensome character. By wasting time with idleness, curiosities, fantasies, crime, pleasures, passions, time shrinks. Men are prodigals, he says, who waste time and end up wasting themselves. Thus he proposes that one ought to seize the day, as a typical poem like this would, and take up one's own possibilities for productive ends, for work, and for writing and stuff. Yet as the poem proceeds, this advice becomes more and more hollow. The one who creates a plan or a project for action, for example, quote, resolves and then dies the same. One ought to recall that knowledge of time is itself constituted by the loss of time. And now what becomes clear is that this prodigious loss cannot be subsumed into either knowledge or the economy of the poem. It insists repeatedly to the point of constituting the rhythm of the sequence of nights. It's made up of 9 books. The first 3 nights are called complaints, in which he does stuff like this and complains about the nature of existence, finitude. The 4th book is a redemption through faith and the immortality of the soul that gives meaning to everything. And the 5th is a relapse. And it's a pattern that goes throughout these books. He relapses and then he complains and relapses. Ultimately, the being for whom time is its own is abandoned to the slippery surface of bare existence. To face time is unbearable, and to flee it is to increase its weight, which is summed up in what the poet calls the riddle of absurdity. Man flees from time, and time from man. Too soon, in sad divorce, this double flight must end. The irony of this double bind is such that no escape is possible. One is locked into the symbolic, enclosed in an ironic self-distancing that only ends in death. Irony converts the horror of existence into a comic predicament, laughing until the end. In line with George Eliot's critique, the preacher demands, which was the radical, in line with George Eliot's critique, the preacher's demand that one use life well is radically insincere. One could also term it deeply ironic. Indeed, time figures in this poem as a principle of irony, around which the reader is tossed this way and that, never able to take up a position in the present without immediately losing it. Demond describes the temporality of irony in terms that are helpful for understanding this. Irony divides the flow of temporal experience into a past that is pure mystification and a future that remains harassed forever by a relapse within the inauthentic. It can know this inauthenticity, but it can never overcome it. It can only restate and repeat it on an increasingly conscious level. But it remains endlessly caught in the impossibility of making this knowledge applicable to the empirical world. It dissolves in the narrowing spiral of a linguistic sign that becomes more and more remote from its meaning, and it can find no escape from this spiral. Although the German romantic Friedrich Schlegel did not have temporality in mind when he wrote on incomprehensibility, the sequence of displacements that he describes in The Irony of Irony could be read as the structural relation to time in Jung's poem. After listing a range of ironies that end up confusing others about one's own intentions, whether in literature or in life, Schlegel turns irony into a mode of negative self-relation that is ultimately comic. If one speaks of irony ironically, without in the process being aware of having fallen into a more noticeable irony, if one can't disentangle oneself from irony anymore, as seems to be happening to me, seems to be happening in this essay on incomprehensibility, if irony turns into a mannerism and becomes, as it were, ironical about the author, if one is promised to be ironical for some useless book without having first checked one's supply and then having to produce it against one's will like an actor full of aches and pains, if irony runs wild and can't be controlled any longer. For Schlegel, the virulence of self-irony figures a double bind. In every attempt to be sincere becomes ironic, and attempting to be ironic about irony leads to an infinite regress of negativity to the point of incomprehensibility. The point and the pointedness of irony is that the subject's understanding is constituted by its ungrounding negativity. Taken up as a subjective position, it is self-annihilating. In David's talk yesterday, we saw that Hegel's response to this infinite irony is to show that it is essentially egotistical. The pathology of a morbid, beautiful soul divorced from the social determinations of cognition. Yet, if the twists and turns of Schlegel's self-irony can be read as a rhetoric of inauthentic temporality that forgets time, or in Jung's terms, flies from time, then it becomes possible to imagine another way out of the double bind. Or rather, it is not a way out, but a withdrawal. This is Jung's wakefulness that we open this whole section with. His insomniac vigilance of the night. He watches the night, And in the moment when every distinction is suspended, when everything vanishes in darkness, disappearance appears. In one of the opening stanzas, he addresses the night in an apostrophe. Night, sable goddess from her ebon throne, in rayless majesty, now stretches forth her leaden scepter over a slumbering world. Silence, how dead, and darkness, how profound, nor eye nor listening ear an object finds. Creation sleeps. 'Tis as the general pulse of life stood still, and nature made a pause. An awful pause, prophetic of her end, and let her prophecy be soon fulfilled. Fate dropped the curtain, I can lose no more. This is like in the opening passages. This awful pause in which no objects can be found is the night as an impasse to experience. Without objects, the subject does not become an object, but rather withdraws into the night. This withdrawing into the night to watch the night, an impossible gesture, is characterized by Jung explicitly as an opaque nature, as an opaque of nature and of soul, this double night. It's the double night. The pause of the double night applies to both the inner world and the exterior nature, uniting them in a movement of pure scattering. This withdrawal is not a withdrawal into the self, but a withdrawal into an unbearable exteriority. All is lost, and he begs fate to come soon. And when it doesn't, he turns to God to transmit one pitying ray to lighten and to cheer. Thus begins his poem as though it is the rupture of logos, or the name in the ancient, quote, ancient night and chaos. And if then he instructs his reader through the torsions of temporal existence, it is in part to point to the fact that irony's faith in the demystifying power of nothingness is in fact a disavowal of what happens when nothing happens. As Blanchot says, it is the night of Jung, when the dark does not seem dark enough, or death ever dead enough. It is the unimaginable falling away, that was the quote. Yeah. It is the unimaginable falling away of the distinctions between life and death, day and night, that paradoxically only the nocturnal imagination can awaken to. It is the night, quote, it is the night that watches. It is the night itself that watches, Levinas writes. It watches. So Edward Jung's poem establishes the ambiguity of the nocturnal imagination. It is not a psychic faculty, not as I'm proposing it anyways, but rather a suspension of the relation between inside and outside, watcher and watched. The nocturnal imagination is a metaphorical relation between day and night that has been suspended interminably. One finds oneself suspended in an inescapable night while time drags on. And this is the premise behind Charlotte Smith's sonnet, To the Sun. The poet sings an ode to the celestial lamp. Better put that on the screen. The poet sings an ode to the celestial lamp, a metaphor for the romantic imagination that bids another day be born and pursues its radiant course across the sky to renovate the world with life and light. Yet at the volta, 4 lines from the bottom, is the thematic turn of the poem at the last 4 lines, something that Charlotte Smith always exploits. The poet reveals all this to be futile. So, 6 lines up. Celestial lamp, thy influence bright and warm that renovates the world with life and light, shines not for me. For nevermore the form I loved, so fondly loved, shall bless my sight, and not thy rays illumine, now can charm my misery, today convert my night. The poem is locked in an interminable night under the sign of nevermore, that the sun cannot convert or metaphorize into the day. Oh, remember, the nevermore always comes up. It comes up in Poe, comes up in Felicia Hemans. So under the nevermore, however, we are not told why the sun cannot convert the night, although it has to do with some love object that has been irretrievably lost. This becomes a sort of ineffable, incommunicable aspect. But what we get is a kind of automated romantic imagination, still producing romantic images, but without any feeling behind it. Indeed, the celestial lamp is a central metaphor for the imagination, yet what it figures here is the barrenness of writing for the sake of writing. The poetic images become mere inscriptions, marking the empty place of the lyric I in the poem. The I has become a bar to the I's capacity to signify. The absent love object and the I are therefore suspended in the absent distinction between day and night, between I and you. And yet these two absences, the one inscribed and the other not, are doubled again by the reader, for whom the italicized now becomes the mark of an infinite distance between themselves and the poet's incommunicable grief. Thus, although the metaphor, or the incommunicable reason for the grief, thus, although the metaphor is nominally there in the word, convert, its temporal movement has been stilled. It is there, but is functionally absent. The poet cannot go on, yet she endures in an endless night, producing only emptinesses in the barren materiality of the letter. The work comes apart by the very mechanisms of its construction, depersonalizing the I and the reader with it. Smith's Endless Night introduces the function of repetition into this concept of the nocturnal imagination. But it is not a repetition through which the subject is positioned. It is a repetition that burrows into the subject, that leaves them porous, a hollow shell. This is what occurs in Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The poem opens with an old mariner who stops a wedding guest outside a party to tell him a tale. Probably everybody's read the poem, but just a summary. He describes a moonless scene, the mariner describes a moonless scene in which a ship, the elementary metaphor for metaphorical transport that he's sailing on, has become stranded and without wind. While adrift, the mariner senselessly kills an albatross. No reason is given. It's just a killing. It is a bad omen, and his furious shipmates hang it around his neck as a sign of guilt. Then all hell breaks loose. His shipmates fall dead and are reanimated. A spectral ghost ship appears with a cadaverous crew. At the end of the poem, the mariner explains that ever since he has been compelled by an unnameable force to repeatedly tell his tale. As Latimer Rajan has argued, he is compelled to return to the scene of his negation to try to reconstitute it in the unity of the poem. And yet all he ends up doing is repeating the initial negation as a pure compulsion that negates himself over and over and over. He says to the wedding guest, I pass like the night from land to land. I have strange power of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me. To him I tell my tale. To him my tale I teach. It is not only that he is compelled to bring the nocturnal compulsion into the day, but that he recognizes this night in others, to whom he must repeat his tale until he dies. This strange power of speech is what Edward Young had referred to as the tongue of loss. The repetition becomes a figure of time wasted and lost, a repetition of the original and essentially incommunicable crime. He himself becomes a figure of scattering and abandonment in an infinite repetition. And late to his own death, the mariner lives a nocturnal existence that Coleridge, in an epitaph he wrote for himself, terms death in life. Every attempt to constitute a meaning that could resolve this negativity ends up in the suspension of metaphor, which forces him to turn back and try again to resolve that unity, hollowing out his life and the poem itself. One way to think about this endless night and the future under the sign of the nevermore is this shift from inner vision, the romantic vision, to vigilance. One keeps a vigil during the time of sleep. A vigil is not a meditation or a time of self-reflection. It is a watch. It's a night watch. And what one watches in the vigil is one's own restlessness in the night. This is what Manfred explains in Byron's poem. This is what Manfred explains alone at midnight in a Gothic gallery, of course, in the opening lines of Byron's Closet Drama. So Manfred speaks. The lamp must be replenished, but even then it will not burn so long as I must watch. My slumbers, if I slumber, are not sleep, but a continuance of enduring thought, which then I can resist not. In my heart there was a vigil, and these eyes but closed to look within, and yet I live and bear the aspect and the form of breathing men. What Manfred watches is not a thing or an object of the imagination. Is not a thing or an object of the imagination. The lamp of the imagination is about to burn out. What he watches is the irresistible movement of his thoughts, born from the knowledge of its own desert, as he will say at the end of the play. Thought appears to Manfred's watch as a purely formal movement without content, a purified mineral evanescence, a death that is framed by a living body. The stream is dry, but wind still blows precipitate across the waste. His relation to this empty movement of thinking is not self-reflexive. Set apart from it, he watches it as Young watches over the appearance of loss in time, linking it thereby to a generalized movement beyond himself. But insofar as it is both his own and beyond him, this watch turns back on him. The wakefulness of being watches his watch, to paraphrase Levinas. Existence is an interminable experience of time for Manfred. Next quote. Thinkest thou existence doth depend on time? It doth, but actions are our epochs. Mine have made days and nights imperishable, endless and all alike, as sands on the shore, innumerable atoms. By some incommunicable action for which he feels responsible and which resulted in the death of his love Astarte, Manfred has been abandoned to a bare existence of pure endurance. The thought over which he keeps vigil is the inorganic mineral waste for which there is no sleep and nothing rests, nor is there any inside or outside. Once this negativity of a past action has irrevocably severed the link between the past and the present, through which the future and meaning becomes possible, the mariner who compulsively But unlike the mariner who compulsively returns to the scene of his crime to reconstitute it, Manfred makes his crime the motor of his existence, as one of the spirits that he conjures up to aid him to forget his pain. Comments, he mastereth himself, and he makes his torture tributary to his will. His fidelity to his wound marks him as too late, not to his own experience, but to his own existence. He is driven towards his own redemption in a death that never arrives. Many long years, but they are nothing now to those which I must number, ages, space and eternity and consciousness, with the fierce thirst of death still unslaked. Yet death is not enough for Manfred. His fidelity to the inorganic mind keeps him from throwing himself off the cliff as he stands on the precipice. Because his body will continue to be wedged within the chasm after death. What he is driven towards is the total oblivion of atoms scattered in the void. What he needs is a Mount Etna, like that of Holderlin's Empedocles. Yet he remains and watches the night. For the night hath been to me a more familiar face than that of man, and in her starry shade of dim and solitary loveliness, I learned the language of another world. There's some nice resonances here and also the talks this week. Manfred is able to read the stars insofar as he is able to read the rhetorical figuration of his nocturnal imagination. To be sure, this is not the legibility of the Freudian unconscious aims to account for. It's a sentence. To be sure, this is not the legibility of the Freudian unconscious that aims to account for the latent desires that cannot be brought into discourse and that distorts conscious activity. The face of the night is a figuration of the void articulated as the void by the dazzling punctures of stars. The hollowness of the rhetorical figure of prosopopoeia is crucial. It is a pure projection of a face onto that which cannot have one. What Manfred reads in the stars is his own empty projection of a face that, looking back on him, annihilates him. He is not there for the night, and it is therefore through the night that he is able to experience the impossible instant of his death, which actual dying would not permit. The nocturnal imagination is an attunement to the horror of existence rather than anxiety of death. It is not an act of will. One cannot decide to imagine that there is, but it happens. In the introduction to this essay, I sought to show that the withdrawal of sleep in Coleridge's insomnia, and this is the last section, by the way, induced this experience of wakefulness stripped of symbolic distinctions. Only the imagination is at play. But he also explicitly theorized it in an essay published in his short-lived periodical, The Friend. And this is a fascinating quote, sort of shooting off into the future. Hast thou ever raised thy mind to the consideration of existence? That should be on the screen. Hast thou ever raised thy mind to the consideration of existence, all caps, in and by itself, as the mere act of existing? Hast thou ever said to thyself thoughtfully, it is? Heedless in that moment whether it were before a man or whether it were a man before thee, or a flower, or a grain of sand, without reference, in short, to this or that particular mode or form of existence, if thou hast indeed attained this, thou wilt have felt the presence of a mystery, which must have fixed thy spirit in awe and wonder. The very words, there is nothing, or there was a time when there was nothing, are self-contradictory. There is that within us which repels the proposition with as full and instantaneous a light, as if it bore evidence against the fact in the right of its own eternity. Not to be, then, is impossible. To be, incomprehensible. If thou hast mastered this intuition of absolute existence, thou wilt have learned likewise that it was this and no other which in the earlier ages seized the nobler minds elect among men with a sort of sacred horror. For Coleridge, what is horrifying is not death or the collapse of the world. It is not the loss of reason in madness. It is the fact of not being. It is the fact that not being is impossible. That existence insists even when it disappears into the anonymous and ungraspable. The impersonal is very important here. It is. The mere act of existing cannot be named or distinguished. That is why, as the passage continues, the understandings, quote, individualization and outlines and differencings by quantity are absolutely irrelevant. Nor can the sense organs detect it. It is not nothing, but is not something either. What it is impossible, but not the possibility of impossibility. It is the possibility of not being possible. An absolutely unrecuperable negativity that cannot be represented, but that nonetheless insists. This form of negation appears in one of Coleridge's most puzzling poems, Limbo, where it is called positive negation. The poem opens like this. "'Tis a strange place, this limbo, not a place, yet name it so, where time and weary existence, fettered from flight, with nightmare sense of fleeing, strive for their last crepuscular half-being, lank space and sightless time with branny hands, barren and soundless as the measuring sands, not marked by flit of shades, unmeaning they, as moonlight on the dial of day." It's rather bleak. A turn for Coleridge. The strange place of limbo has a name but not a place. At first sight, this is the inverse of the anonymous it is. Yet without a place, the name simply floats as though suspended. It has no reference, no referent, and thus no meaning. Which is to say, it floats as a pure signifier that taken in itself signifies nothing. Being a present absence, it has a materiality of its own, and that is all it has. This material density is doubled by the pure immobility of fettered place and time. Like a corpse that is riveted to its place, but is out of place, space and time continue to persist in a state of suspension. They struggle out of the night into their last crepuscular half-being, but to no avail, unmeaning they as moonlight on the dial of day. Angus Fletcher's claim that the poem concerns the problem of crossing a threshold seems to miss the point that nothing here can cross the bar of signification. Indeed, as Morgan Paley points out, the moonlight on the dial of day is a figure of unreadability, of illegibility. Even the shades are not flitting around in this not a place. This is why Coleridge's Limbo is differentiated. I didn't cite. I had initially cited Hegel's description of night and then decided to take it out because it's cited everywhere on the night. But I forgot to take out the lead up to it. Anyways, it's not applicable here. Let's just put it that way. We'll leave it at that, okay? And while the poem goes on to present a symbol of human time in the figure of an old blind man staring at the moon, a perfect image of the romantic imagination right in the middle of the poem, it cuts off this image and follows with this. No such sweet sights doth limbo den immure, walled round and made a silent jail secure by the mere horror of blank not at all, whose circumambience doth these ghosts enthrall. A lurid thought is growthless, dull privation, yet that is but a purgatory curse. Hell knows a fear far worse, a fear, a future state, 'tis positive negation. I take positive negation to be the name that Coleridge offers here for what he called the sacred horror of the it is. If a growthless thought is dull privation, it can still be carried over to signify precisely that. But the horror of blank not at all cannot signify it as the pure act of existence, the impossibility of not being possible, which is nonetheless still a future. Limbo was not published until Coleridge was on his deathbed. And it was this is the last. It was originally part of a longer and very chaotic notebook entry in April 1811. It began with John Donne about the flea. His things crossed out. It doesn't make any sense. And all of a sudden you get that, you get Limbo, and then you get this one. So the entry that followed immediately after Limbo was another poem that was eventually published also on his deathbed as Ne Plus Ultra, although it was a name that was given by his editor, and so not really a significance. The poem begins with a cry into the void. Soul positive of night, antipathist of light, fate's only essence, primal scorpion rod, the one permanent opposite of God, condensed blackness and abysmal storm, compacted to one scepter amidst arms the grasp and norm, the interceptor. There's a few more, but we're going to leave it at that. There's a few more lines, but this is the end. And Coleridge renames positive negation into the much richer soul positive of night, and does so with the horror of one who is tormented by the unbearable. It's like every line strikes out at the reader from whom strikes out at the reader from whom is breathing their last breath. If God is the omnipotent and omniscient, then nothing is also his domain. But the soul positive of night is the abandoned, the absolutely withdrawn. It watches like a presence in God's nothingness, a scepter and an interceptor that bars the way out of existence. Thank you.